Hi, this is Greg Rasner here with Third Party Threat Hunters, our episode 5, I believe, if I'm counting correctly. And today I have with me the CEO of ICS2, Clar Rosso, and she's agreed to join us. I had the pleasure of meeting Claire last year at the ICS2 Congress. I was lucky enough to get a few minutes of her time during a breakfast meeting, and it was off to the races because she and I have a lot of the same passions in the risk space. But it would be great to get Claire on and talk to have her kind of explain what ICS Squared is doing beyond just the cyber. I've been a CISSP for a number of years and obviously came into it with that. But the team is doing a great things. And so I want to just stop there and Claire, let you introduce yourself a little bit and then we can just get going.
All right. Well, Greg, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm very excited. In fact, I have a visual that I'm going to have to share for those that can
Oh,
see this. But
uh-oh.
I have Greg's book
Uh,
nearby me at all
uh,
times.
oh, that's so
I
nice of
didn't know
you.
I was going to give him a little plug, but I think it's a great book.
Oh, thank you.
Truth be
That's really
told,
nice
I
of you.
read it on airplanes. But what I like is it talks about risk in kind of plain English. It's a little
Oh,
bit more than that. And I actually think that that's really important for the business community because
right.
lots of people need to understand risk, need to understand third party risk. And so I really appreciate that. But I'm thrilled to be here, CEO of ISC2. We have 370,000 members, candidates, and associates around the world right now. Best known for our CISSP, which you hold, cybersecurity certification. I like to, for non-cyber folks, explain that CISSP is to cybersecurity what CPA is
Yeah,
to
that's a good,
accounting.
that's a great analogy. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right.
Yeah. And so we can talk more about what ISC2 does later. I would just a tiny bit more about me is I spent 3 decades working with the accounting and finance profession before joining ISC2. So I have strong, deep roots in the risk space and the risk management space, which I think is what has made my connection with you and this topic in particular so interesting and fascinating to talk about.
We talked about, I think we spent about 15 minutes on the SOC 2s and how much
Yes.
we have a love-hate relationship with them in some ways, right? So that was a fun talk. And actually, I spoke at the ASIS Congress and somebody asked me at my presentation what do I think about SOC 2 type 2s, and I remember saying you're a plant, because I thought they were setting me up for an ambush, but it was a good conversation. So. Um, your team has really, I think, expanded beyond cyberspace, but in some ways are trying to make sure that knowledge about your expansion into other areas besides cyber risk is well known. So, would you just mind giving the audience a little bit of understanding about what the team is doing in that space and how you're trying to expand it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So we have as an organization, we have 10 cybersecurity certifications ranging from an entry level no experience certification, which I will talk more about, to the CISSP, which is the pinnacle of all cybersecurity certification. So while we remain completely committed to that space, we know that cybersecurity, information and system security is now truly a global issue that impacts all businesses. So we are working in that space in a couple different ways to add visibility, ensure best practices, and raise some sometimes uncomfortable conversations. So number one is as cyber threats have proliferated, especially once the whole world moved to remote work 3 years ago during the pandemic, a
Yeah.
lot of attention globally has been focused on by legislators and regulators on cybersecurity and how do we regulate that space. And what we saw as an organization is a proliferation of different laws, different regulations all across the globe. And when you are dealing with a borderless issue like cybersecurity, you really need global harmonization of laws and regulations. So that's a space we play in. And in fact, later this month in April, we are releasing a report that looks at 6 main markets across the globe and how they're dealing with cybersecurity issues.
Oh, I'm
So
eager to hear that.
yeah, so that's one. Another thing we're doing um, in a very focused way, is focusing on what we consider one of the biggest risks in cybersecurity, and that is our workforce gap. So we have 4.7 million cybersecurity professionals globally. It's a lot. Some of those, we count a cybersecurity professional as somebody who spends as little as 25% of their time protecting an organization's information and systems.
Right.
However, and this won't be the scariest number I will give you. However, we have a gap or unfilled demand for cybersecurity professionals of about 3.4 million globally.
Yeah, that's an incredible number.
I know. So the good news is businesses recognize that there is a need to protect their information and systems. So I think that's positive. Here's the scary bit, though. When we looked at organizations with 100 or fewer professionals, 95% of those have no information or system security professionals on staff at all.
Wow.
And so when I think about what you talk about, Greg, and when you think about third-party cyber risk and third-party supply chain risk and the size of companies sometimes that are feeding into bigger organizations' supply chain,
right,
this is a huge issue. And so we have an obligation to help raise visibility to that problem, and then help businesses, help cyber professionals, help boards of directors understand what they should be thinking about and what they're doing about that.
Well, in the cyberspace, it can be very complex and really intimidating for folks who aren't familiar with the space. And I really applaud the need and grabbing folks and educating folks from other fields, because I think they bring a perspective into cyber that is unique and refreshing. I always try and look for folks in non-cyber fields to bring into cyber, because I think they actually educate us in ways about how business operates, or about new opportunities, about ways to look at things. The secret is about my own education about cyber third-party risk, because I didn't do it before I did it 5 years ago. I just did good cyber, and I had a good liberal arts education. And when I went to go look and start at Heritage BB&T, I looked for a book on how to do cyber third-party risk, and there wasn't one. So, okay, I just have to go roll up my sleeves and figure it out. And then right before COVID, actually during COVID and right before SolarWinds, there still wasn't a book. And that's when, okay, somebody needs to start to figure out a way to educate as best as I could how we were successful in the program that we created at Heritage BB&T, our Truist. And so it's the same thing. Let's figure out a way to start to bring people in from other fields, from other interests. Again, I'm harping on the third-party risk space because that's my space, but you're also starting a program in the third-party risk space as well, are you not? And if you'd like to share that with the audience.
Sure, I'd like to share that, and then I'd like to also talk about what you just talked about in terms of attracting people from other fields.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about third-party risk. So when we are looking at third-party risk, we are standing up this year, and you have graciously agreed to participate, but we're standing up a third-party risk, cyber risk task force to actually dive into this issue and talk about what does the profession need, what do businesses need, and how can we best help them. And so I'm super excited about that. I think that kind of professional guidance from the experts that's going to emerge from the work of your task force is going to be really valuable. We actually separately and in parallel are looking at risks around cyber insurance. Because so that's a separate task force, but we have a separate task force that's looking at cyber insurance and all the inherent risks around cyber insurance, and trying to include part of the insurance industry in that conversation as well. So that's another one. And then in that same space, and at the end of the day, the foundation of cybersecurity is risk management. So really, risk touches everything that we do.
We're all risk professionals. Some have specialties in financial risk or reputational risk or strategic, in our case, cyber. but I agree. It really does help folk and create a more of a partnership if we're talking as risk professionals, and sometimes not focus on where our specialties are, because those principles stay true regardless of what pillar you happen to be in, I think.
I think so. And I think we're seeing a marketplace shift. I think we're seeing a shift. If we think back, those of us who can in our professional lives,
I hate to admit that, but you're right.
own it, own it. If I think back 2 decades, what was the buzz in the marketplace? 2 decades ago, we were talking about financial risk for organizations.
Right.
We saw the collapse of Enron. We saw the collapse of Arthur Andersen and financial risk, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
SOX. I was just going to say SOX
Yeah,
is
it
a
just
result of that, right?
became front and center. And all of a sudden, people were saying, wait, hey, we need to be paying attention for this. So we saw the activity with public company boards of directors. So we saw that happen in the financial space. Then, although we haven't seen it as rigorously at the federal level in the US, we have seen globally, I would say over the past decade or so, we've really seen this hyper focus of organizations on privacy and the protection of confidential information. Also, very important to at cyber information and systems security profession. And,
Right.
We're a little bit more about not just about what you need to protect, but also like the nuts and bolts of how are you going to protect that? It's super important.
Yep.
So, but anyways, we saw that, and we saw boards of directors talking about that. We saw leaders of organizations talking about that. I would say now we're seeing the emergence of cyber risk coming up at that C-suite level, coming up with the boards of the directors. We're expecting any day the SEC to make recommendations about cyber expertise and public company boards.
So it's got the if the regulators are focused on it, the boards are going to be focused on it. And it's amazing to me that was it almost a year and a half ago now, that you had the interagency guidance when you can get FRB, FDIC, and the OCC all doing the same thing. Something's changing, right? Because those three organizations generally don't collaborate. Not that they can't, but they generally don't need to, because they're in slightly different spaces in terms of size. But they came out with an interagency, and now you have the SEC doing it as well. Okay, boards are starting. We got to pay attention, right? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I think at the governmental level that there's just a recognition that cyber risk is not just economic risk. It's not just risk to one organization, but a lot of the cyber risk is risk to what's critical national infrastructure, and it's frankly a national defense risk.
It is,
so that's part of what's really getting the profession the attention it finally deserves.
I sometimes just, when I talk about this and why cyber risk can sometimes seem more a bigger focus than the other risk domains, especially in the third-party risk space. It's not that the other risk domains aren't important. What happens with cyber is once there's an incident or a breach or event in that space, it almost always bleeds over into the other risk domains, and that isn't always true of the other risk domains when there's something happens in those events. And so that's why cyber, I think, gets more attention because one, the threat actors have really stepped up their game since COVID and since the lockdowns. And then we've seen the financial and other strategic and reputational repercussions with all the folks getting breached and everything else. And my axiom that is everybody is somebody else's vendor, right? So everybody's selling to somebody in some fashion, and so the amount of cyber activity you get is just exponentially growing. So everybody's getting affected, and it's bouncing around like a pinball. And I really like to see the organizations get more predictive than reactive. Right now, we're very reactive, and that's a very bad place to be in, both from a support standpoint and from an ability to get ahead of some of these issues. Claire, go ahead. Sorry.
Now, I was going to just say, I was thinking about that, and I'm thinking about, and this is why, because I think some people might say, what do you mean workforce is one of the biggest risks in the cybersecurity?
Yeah, please tease that one out more.
So here's one of the reasons why. So 2 years ago, we started asking in our annual workforce study, we said, why does this matter? Why, if you don't have enough information system security staff, does it matter? And why it matters is because of what organizations don't do when they don't have enough staff. And let me just give you a couple examples that may resonate with you. 48%. So the biggest thing they don't do is we don't spend enough time on proper risk assessment and management. That was number one. Then it moves on to oversight in our processes and procedures. We're slow to patch our critical system, which, obviously is impacting your risk. We're misconfiguring systems, and then we're not training our staff. Both, we're not training and upskilling our cyber staff the way we should in a very dynamic threat landscape. But we're also, because it's not just about your cyber staff, it's about all your staff, and elevating their cyber literacy, or having them think differently about how they help manage the risk of an organization. But that requires education. So those are some of the biggest reasons why we think the workforce issue is just really so imperative for us to address. And some of the good news is, and you alluded to this earlier in your practice, is we've done research that shows us what type of people are successful in cybersecurity, of which risk is our foundation. And when we look at mindset or personality attributes, we see problem solvers and critical and analytical thinkers, creative people. So again, people that think differently about how they solve problems. And that they have a certain also core set of non-technical skills that make them successful, ranging from project management, working individually and in a team, communication skills.
You're hitting all the marks, Claire. It's great.
If organizations can hire for those things, then train for the technical parts that you need.
I've said that on all the times through the years is I can train almost anybody on cybersecurity or IT. What I can't train you for is a desire to work, a curiosity to fix a problem, creative thinking. And so again, I agree with you. If we can bring people in with those skill sets and that desire to learn, cyber is not that difficult. I mean, I learned it, and I was a dumb grunt at one point, right? So, and I was in the infantry. So all I do is point a weapon in one direction. I wasn't like I was really doing the hard thinking. So again, you can train folks on cybersecurity just like you could on accounting or to be a flight engineer. What you can't train somebody for is that curiosity and the ability to really want to learn and expand in it. Yeah. Once you get them in, I find that they are able to solve problems that sometimes long-term cybersecurity professionals couldn't, because they kind of had the blinders on of this is the way it's always been done, right? And so I think that's a great. I'm eager to see that your team's work on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and then to go in parallel to for the skeptics, because we know there will be skeptics. They're a particular sector we find the skeptics in, but so what we did with this to address the issues of the skeptics is we created our No Experience Certified in Cybersecurity certification.
Right, that's great.
And so what that does is it tells an employer, hey, this person has the aptitude to learn the technical part of what you're trying to teach them. And then for the individual, it gives them an idea of, well, so what does network security look like? What do they mean by access management? What are these security principles? What is an incident response? So they can get a view into that and say, is it for me or is it not? And interestingly, we've talked to organizations and governments who've looked at that certification and that sort of elevated cyber literacy it gives people and said, you know what, I want my folks that are in adjacent roles to go through this and understand that. I want my IT team to do it. I want maybe even my finance or internal audit team to go through this, where if you have GRC team or a risk management team. Let's have them elevate their skill set a little bit in this space too.
I did not know about that. This is why I do these podcasts, is to learn, right? And then just talk to cool people. But I did not know that about that certification. I'd seen it, but hadn't looked into it. So I make sure that when we advertise for this podcast, that we focus in on some of those folks in the space who are trying to get into this space but aren't sure of where to start first. I think that's a great opportunity for them to take that and to your point, just get, hey, I've got some aptitude to do this. Can I? Because there's always a complaint, and I do kind of poo-poo it sometimes because there are spaces where you can do this, but it's hard to break into cyber. Well, yes. If you want to be a threat intelligence person at the start, that may not be the space you want to start with. There are other spaces to start with, and this is a great first step. So I'll make sure that we advertise for that, Claire, on this. I think that's a great education. And the price point is excellent, right?
On-demand education and the exam for free. We committed to do 1 million certified in cybersecurity. We're just under 200,000 enrollments right now.
So you've got some space.
There's still space.
Quite a few. Well, that's great news too. I'll make sure that we advertise that because I think that's important for the community and the broader community to know. So what else did we want to talk about? I think you were doing some work around GRC space too, right? Which is also something that I'm really passionate about because the governance pieces are often missing. What the word rigor, or I'm looking for the word, but I think sometimes GRC is given a bit short shrift in some spaces because, oh gosh, I've got to do the governance stuff. And that's the way it's looked at, right? But it is really critical to be able to repeat, rinse, and cycle as you do these things. So take it away, Claire.
All right. And I may turn the table and ask some questions to you in this space.
Oh, dear.
So prepare
my mute bucket. Okay.
But so we historically had a certification. We created it actually for the DoD, Department of Defense here in the U.S. And it was called the CAP, Certified Authorization Professional. And I remember talking to, so I thought authorization, I thought access management. Remember, I was new to cybersecurity 2.5 years ago. I said, tell me more about our certification. And the team was talking to me about it. And I said, well, wait a second. This isn't about access management. This is about governance, risk, and compliance. Why are we not talking about it as such? And so we actually relaunched the certification this year with its new name and have this higher focus on the governance, risk, and compliance aspect. And one of the really interesting things I saw today, this wasn't even prep, just by chance I saw today, is when we actually look at the holders of our certification, the most diverse group of certification holders we have is for our governance, risk, and compliance area. And I imagine because it's not deemed like that purely technical space.
Yeah, so unfortunately, that's true.
It makes it a little less scary for people. But here's my question for you. And then, and this isn't just my question for you. This is my question for regulators around the globe and others, is when I think about governance, risk, and compliance, and this even can go to us talking about the SOC 2 reports. I always worry as somebody who runs a business about what I would call checklist mentality.
Yes.
It just, it's like, oh, we did it. We complied. And it's like, but did we comply in a way that we truly are evaluating the systems within our organization and making lasting change? Or did we comply in a way that we just checked a bunch of boxes until next year when we check a bunch of boxes again? And so this is where I'm turning the tables on you and going to ask you a question. So I'm really curious how you think about that and any examples of where do you see that organizations get that right when they're thinking about risk and not just making it a checklist activity?
And actually, you hit a point that I'm passionate about is too, because compliance is not security, right? And I think some of this comes out of reactive behavior because regulators set a set of goals that they want folks in the field to meet. And so, to your point, because there's not enough cybersecurity professionals or third-party risk professionals or whatever it is that the regulators are focused on, a lot of companies will approach it from a compliance standpoint and the dirty compliance standpoint, sort of the lazy compliance standpoint is what I use. And I don't mean to be overly pejorative towards it, but it is more of a checklisty approach. And as you in the book, I hate checklists. I think that there are the bane of an assessment, and in particular when you do a physical validation, what's called an on-site assessment used to be called on-site physical validation. I throw out checklists and say I need to have a conversation with your vendor about their security, because a conversation means we're talking, right? If I'm on a checklist, all you're going to see is my bald head doing, do you do this? Yeah, great. You do that? No, okay, good. Right? That's not a conversation. It doesn't produce much value. It doesn't get to the heart of, let's say you're the vendor, it doesn't get to the heart of whether or not you're doing good security for me as a company, as a customer, and it doesn't build trust. And I think that's the thing often that's missing in a conversation with whether it's an assessment process or it's organizations within a company talking. That conversation builds trust, and then you can build on that, right? You can have other conversations about other ways to improve collaboratively security across the board. So I totally agree with you. I think where I've seen it fall down is when a company does it just enough to get the regulators or third line off their back. And that's an unfortunate mentality. Where companies succeed at it is they say, and it's the way I try and design my programs and teach others to do it, is this isn't a compliance function. This is a cybersecurity function, cybersecurity risk function. Cybersecurity is not compliance. It is an ongoing activity that you need to validate is going and ongoing. Whether you do point-in-time assessments and mix that with continuous monitoring, or you have a continuing conversation with your vendors that are high risk and not doing well. However you tackle that is up to you. But please don't just check a box, because you've got the regulators off your back. But when you get breached, they're going to be all over you, because that's only a matter of time if all you're doing it is as a checkbox function. Sorry, I'll stop now. Don't ask me another question, because I'll take up the rest of the time.
I agree with you completely. And, well over a decade ago in the finance world, and specifically in the financial audit space, new risk-based assessment standards were published for auditors. And I'll tell you, it's taken well over a decade for the auditors to figure out how exactly I do that. Because it was pulling teeth to say, no, you're not sitting down doing a checklist. You're having a conversation with your client and key individuals within your client's business to really understand where might the risks in this business be, and what should I be investigating as something worth my, deeper look. And those takes more time, but completely worthwhile.
Well, and you can also read things like body language and oh wait, the person got a little uncomfortable when I asked that question. Maybe I want to focus in on that one a little bit, or that answer didn't quite jive with how I think best practice is. Can we tease that one out a bit more, please? Right. So again, conversations versus checklists is really kind of my mantra often, just because it just produces more value. You as a assessor get more out of it as well. I think I've learned from vendors, because I've seen vendors also solve problems in ways I wouldn't have thought of, and said, I wouldn't have gotten that from a checklist, right? Because I asked a question. I didn't just say yes or no. Right.
Right.
And a GRC function too is often undervalued in a lot of organizations. So I'm glad that you're focusing on getting folks certified and educated. When I got the CISSP, it wasn't, the certification was important, and I'm glad I got it, but it's what I learned in getting to the CISSP that was more valuable. I wrote the book. Yes, I'm glad I wrote the book. I had to learn a lot to write that book. I had to sit down and learn. Right. So sometimes it's not just the journey of what you accomplish. It's what you got along the way, is more important. So again, it's not just that you're doing a certification in the GRC space. It's you're going to educate folks to get to a space where they're more they're just more educated and more versed in best practice. And sometimes you can't always do best practice, but you can try and get to it in your organization, right? That's always the goal. Perfection is a goal, right? It's not always achievable, but getting to it is important.
Right, and what you do once you earn it. So this is, to me, this is also the difference between like a one and done certificate that somebody
Mm,
earns and having a certification, because with a certification goes back to that core desire for lifelong learning is
yes,
you have to constantly be learning to keep it up and maintain your competence in this space.
exactly. Well, we're at 30 minutes, and I think we could go for another 30. But maybe what we do is I schedule for another one later in the year after IC Square Congress, which is in Nashville this year, which I'm really happy about because I no or disrespect towards Las Vegas. I'm just looking forward to not having to get on a 6-hour flight from the East Coast. So
Me too. Me
yeah,
too. Or the leave this, since we're both on the East Coast here, or leave Las Vegas at midnight to get
yes,
home to
yes.
transfer planes at 5 in the morning.
Oh
Yeah.
yes, yeah. And also the $15 lattes inside the casinos are bothersome as well. I remember that. um, any last thoughts or last questions you can think of, Claire?
Well, I just want to first thank you so much for having me on your
Oh,
show.
my
I want
pleasure.
to this topic is so important and we need so many more people talking about it. So I'm thrilled you have the podcast. I'm thrilled you have the book. I hear rumor you're writing another book, which
I am. I actually just so it's called Zero Trust and Third Party Risk. And so what reduce the blast radius is the subtitle. And the idea there is, and I'll give props to the IC Square Congress because I do these talks often because I can get a free ticket to what sometimes is an expensive event. No offense, at least from out of pocket. And I did attend a lot of the sessions that I attended George Finney's, who gave me. I've been trying to put the two and two together. I knew there was some overlap, but I couldn't figure it out. And George put it together for me in his talk, and I reached out to him. And I've got that. It's with Wiley. It'll be out right before ISIS Core Congress, so we're thinking late summer. I've got the first. The whole draft is in. I'm working on the. I've got the first part already re-edited, and so I'm waiting for the second part to come back and clean all that up. Right. Um, uh, that will be it, by the way, because I told my wife if I ever say I've got a good idea for a book to find a sharp object and start stabbing me with it until I stop moving, because I really don't understand how I volunteer for these things. But I'm really excited about it coming out. I'll make sure if I get one, I'll bring one and grab and give you one at the Congress Square.
that would be fabulous. I would appreciate that very much. So
Sure.
thanks so much. Thanks for having me on your show, and thanks for what you're doing to get out the word and create a safe and secure cyber world.
Thanks. All right. All right. Well, this will drop in a couple of days, and I'm looking forward to getting the feedback from it.
All
Thanks, Claire.
right.
Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
on.
Take care.
Thanks.